The day we buried my mother, my stepfather slid a piece of paper across the funeral home table and told me I had 30 days to start paying rent or get out of the house she'd left me. I want you to understand the timing of that. My mother's casket hadn't even been lowered yet. We were in that little side room they give grieving families, the one with the box of tissues and the fake plant in the corner. And I still had dirt on the heels of my shoes from the cemetery. My eyes were swollen shut from 3 days of crying. And there he was, sliding a typed sheet across the table like a man closing a business deal. $800 a month, he said. First and last up front. That's more than fair, considering. Considering what? I almost asked. Considering that my mother had been in the ground for 45 minutes? Considering that the house he was charging me rent on had her name on the deed? Not his? But I didn't say any of that. I just stared at the paper, at the cold little font, and I felt something inside me go very quiet. That quiet would turn out to be the most important thing that ever happened to me. I just didn't know it yet. My name is Whitney, and I was 28 years old the week my whole life cracked open. Let me back up, because if I just start with the funeral, you'll think I was a fool for ever letting it get that far. And maybe I was, but grief makes you slow, and love makes you blind, and I'd had a lifetime of practice telling myself that the man my mother married was just difficult. My father died when I was 9. Heart attack, no warning. Gone before the ambulance reached the driveway. For 4 years after that, it was just my mother and me in that house on Ledford Street, the one with the crooked front porch and the maple tree my dad had planted the year I was born. We were poor in money and rich in everything else. She worked 2 jobs and still found time to braid my hair every single morning. I have never in my life felt safer than I did in those 4 years. Then she met him. I'll call him my stepfather because I refuse to give him anything warmer than that, even now. He came in smiling, brought flowers, fixed the porch step, called my mother the loveliest thing in 3 counties. He was good at the beginning part. Men like him always are. The cruelty comes later in small doses, so slow you mistake it for normal before you realize it was there at all. They married when I was 13. He moved into our house, and within a year he'd convinced my mother to add his name to a joint checking account to make the bills easier. Within 2 years, he'd talked her into letting his grown son from a previous marriage move into the spare room, the room that had been my father's office. Within 3, the maple tree was gone, cut down because he said the roots were a liability. I cried about that tree for a week. He told me to grow up. My mother changed under him. Not all at once. She got quieter. She stopped braiding my hair, stopped humming in the kitchen, started apologizing for things that weren't her fault. The 2 jobs she worked were no longer hers. Somehow the money flowed to him, and she had to ask for grocery cash, like a child asking for an allowance. I watched the brightest person I'd ever known dim down to a flicker, and I was too young to know what I was watching, only that it scared me. I left for college at 18 on a scholarship I'd half killed myself to earn, mostly to get out of that house. I studied accounting. People laugh when I tell them that, accounting of all things, but I want you to remember it, because numbers are the reason I'm still standing. I learned how money moves. I learned that money always leaves a trail, no matter how careful a person thinks they're being. That lesson saved my life. I built a real life out there. Got a job at a mid-sized firm in the city 2 hours away, rented a little apartment with a window that caught the morning sun. For the first time since I was 9, I felt like myself again. I called my mother every Sunday. Sometimes he'd be in the room and she'd talk in that careful, flattened voice, and I'd hang up wanting to drive back and pull her out of there. But she always said the same thing. I'm fine, baby. Don't you worry about me. You go live your life. So I did. And I have to carry that. I lived my life while she shrank inside that house, and I will spend a long time forgiving myself for not seeing how bad it had gotten. Then, 18 months ago, she called me on a Tuesday, which she never did, and her voice was different, clear somehow. Awake. Whitney, she said. I need to tell you some things, and I need you to listen and not talk until I'm done. She told me she'd been to a doctor. Pancreatic. Stage 4. They were talking months, not years. And then she said the thing that changed everything. The thing I didn't understand, the weight of until much later. I've been getting my affairs in order, she said. Quietly. He doesn't know. The house is yours, Whitney. I made sure of it. I went to a lawyer in the next county over so he wouldn't find out. Whatever happens, whatever he tells you, that house belongs to you and only you. There's a folder. When the time comes, you'll know where to look. I drove home that same night. I took a leave from work, and for the next 11 months, I lived in my childhood home again, sleeping in my old bedroom, taking care of my dying mother, while my stepfather and his son moved around the house like landlords inspecting a property. He did not lift one finger to help her. Not one. I was the one who learned to change the dressings, who measured the morphine, who held the basin when she was sick and sang to her the way she used to sing to me. He'd come home from wherever he went all day, walk past her room without looking in, and ask me what was for dinner. His son was worse, if that's possible, a man in his 30s who played video games until 3 in the morning and complained that my mother's moaning kept him up. The only thing my stepfather ever wanted to talk about during those months was the house. He'd corner me in the kitchen. Your mother and I have been talking, he'd say, though I knew for a fact she could barely talk by then. We think the house should stay in the family. The whole family, meaning his son, meaning him. He had a way of saying family that made my skin crawl, because I knew exactly who he was carving out of that word. I just nod and go back to my mother. I didn't argue. The quiet thing inside me, the one that started at the funeral table, it was already there, even then. I was watching. I was remembering. I was, though I didn't have the words for it, building a case. My mother died on a grey morning in October, with her hand in mine, and the last thing she said being my father's name. I won't tell you the rest of that morning. Some things you keep. The funeral was 4 days later. And 45 minutes after we put her in the ground, my stepfather slid that paper across the table. 800 a month, he said, or you find somewhere else to live. I looked at him. His son was there too, slouched in the corner chair, scrolling on his phone at his own step-grandmother's funeral. And I heard myself say, in a voice so calm it surprised even me, "Can I think about it?" He smiled. He thought he'd won. "Take all the time you need," he said, generous now that he believed he had me. "Rent starts the 1st of the month." I drove back to the house, went into my old room, shut the door, and I did not cry. I want you to know that. I had cried for 3 days, and I would cry plenty more in the months to come. But in that moment, something else took over. I sat down on the edge of my childhood bed, and I thought about the folder. My mother had said I'd know where to look, and I did. When I was little, she kept her important things, my dad's watch, my baby teeth, the deed to the house, in a tin box on the top shelf of her closet behind the winter blankets. He'd never have thought to look there. Men like him don't think women have secrets worth keeping. I waited until the next afternoon when both of them were gone. He to wherever he went, the son to wherever sons like that go. I went into my mother's closet, reached up behind the blankets, and there it was. The same dented tin box from my childhood, heavier than I remembered. Inside was a manila folder, and inside that folder was my mother's quiet, careful 11-month revenge. The deed to the house, updated 14 months earlier, with only my name on it. She'd transferred it out of the joint situation entirely, used a lawyer 2 counties over, and recorded it at the county office herself. The house was legally, completely, indisputably mine. But that wasn't all. My mother had been an accountant's mother, and apparently the apple didn't fall far. There were bank statements, photocopies of cancelled checks, a handwritten ledger in her shaky end-stage handwriting, and a letter addressed to me that I have read so many times I could recite it in my sleep. I'm not going to share all of what that letter said, but I'll tell you the part that mattered. She wrote that over the years, she'd watched my stepfather move money out of accounts that should have been hers, out of the small inheritance her own mother had left her, out of the life insurance payout from my father that was supposed to be set aside for my education. She wrote that she'd been too tired and too afraid to fight him while she was alive, but that she kept records. She kept everything. And she wrote in the last line, "Use the numbers, baby. You always were better with them than I was. Make it count." I sat on the floor of her closet and I read those statements 3 times. And as an accountant, I saw what she'd seen, but with trained eyes. I saw a pattern of withdrawals that lined up with nothing legitimate. I saw a credit card I didn't recognize, opened in my mother's name. But the address listed was a P.O. box, and the spending was all his. I saw a second account at a bank I'd never heard of, with a balance that made my stomach drop. And then I found the thing that turned my grief into something with a spine. There was a check, photocopied, dated 2 months before my mother's diagnosis. It was a withdrawal from her personal account, the one she'd had since before she married him, the one she thought was private, for $11,000. The memo line, in his handwriting, said, "Loan." Below the photocopy, in my mother's hand, she'd written, "I never saw this money. I never agreed to this. He forged my signature. I have proof." Forgery. Identity theft. He'd opened credit in her name. He'd forged her signature on her own accounts. These weren't family disagreements. These were crimes, and my mother, in the last clear months of her life, had built me a map to every single one of them. Now, I want to be honest about what I did next, because I know how these stories usually go. I know the version where the wrong daughter screams and throws a drink and storms out in righteous fury. That's not what I did. I'd spent a lifetime learning that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who wins. The quiet thing inside me knew exactly what it was doing. I went back to my stepfather 2 days later and I told him I decided to pay the rent. You should have seen his face. Smug doesn't begin to cover it. "Smart girl," he said. "Knew you'd come around. First of the month?" I agreed. "Come round. First of the month," I agreed. And I smiled at him, and I went upstairs, and I started making copies of everything. Here is the part I need you younger folks to hear, because the comments on stories like mine are always full of people asking why the daughter didn't just call the police on day 1, why she didn't just scream the house down. I'll tell you why. Because if I had walked into a police station the day after the funeral, sobbing, with a wild story about my stepfather, what would they have had? A grieving woman's accusations against a calm, smiling man. He'd have had a story ready. He always did. Men like him are never caught by emotion. They're caught by paper. So I gave him paper. I let him think he'd won. I paid him $800 on the first of the month by check, on purpose, so there'd be a record that I, the legal owner of the home, was being extorted for rent on my own property by a man with no legal claim to it. Do you understand what I was doing? I was building the case my mother started. I was an accountant. I knew that the difference between a sad story and a conviction is documentation. I spent 6 weeks living in that house, smiling at him over breakfast, while I quietly did the following. I made certified copies of the deed and confirmed with the county that it was clean and recorded. The house was mine, free and clear, no liens, no joint ownership, nothing. I photographed every page of my mother's records and backed them up to a cloud account and a drive I kept in my car, never in the house. I pulled my own credit report and my mother's final ones and found 2 more accounts opened fraudulently. I contacted the bank where he'd hidden the second account. And because some of the activity involved my mother's forged signature and her estate was now in probate, I learned exactly how to request the records legally. And then I did the thing that mattered most. I found a lawyer. Not a screaming lawyer, a patient, terrifying woman named Dolores who specialized in elder financial abuse and estate fraud, and who looked at my mother's folder for a long time before she set it down, took off her glasses and said, "Your mother was very brave and very smart. We're going to be just fine." Dolores explained the landscape to me. Forging a signature to withdraw funds is forgery and fraud. Opening credit accounts in someone else's name is identity theft, a felony in our state. Misappropriating funds from a vulnerable elderly person, and my mother had qualified as a vulnerable adult under the law in her final year, carried its own enhanced penalties. The fact that he was now extorting rent from the rightful homeowner was, as Dolores put it with a thin smile, just the cherry, dear. The cake was already baked. We assembled everything. We coordinated with the bank's fraud department, who had their own interest in the forged signatures. We brought in the county's adult protective services, who opened a file. and we waited until we had it all locked down. Because Dolores taught me the same thing my career had. You don't make the move until you can't lose. I kept living in the house the whole time. I kept paying the rent. I kept smiling. It was the hardest acting I've ever done in my life, sitting across from the man who'd robbed my dying mother, passing him the salt, while his arrest was being assembled, file by file, in a lawyer's office across town. His son, by the way, never suspected a thing either. He once told me, mouthful of cereal, that I'd finally learned my place. I just nodded and thought about how much I was going to enjoy what came next. It came on a Thursday morning. I'd arranged to be out of the house. I won't pretend I didn't want to be there, but Dolores said it was cleaner if I wasn't. The bank's fraud case had matured. The DA's office had reviewed everything and found it, in their words, an unusually well-documented case. That's what happens when a dying accountant's daughter, who's also an accountant, builds your prosecution for you. They arrested him at the house in front of the neighbors on charges of forgery, identity theft, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. His son, it turned out, had co-signed on one of the fraudulent accounts, thinking it was free money, so they had questions for him too. The smug drained right out of both of them, I'm told. The legal process took the better part of a year, and I'm not going to pretend it was a movie. It was depositions and waiting in forms, and the strange grief of seeing your mother's handwriting entered into evidence. But the documentation was airtight, because she and I had made it airtight, and in the end my stepfather pleaded out rather than face a jury with all that paper stacked against him. He's serving time now. Real time, in a real place, the kind you don't talk your way out of with a smile. The court ordered restitution of every dollar he'd taken, with the house never in question because, legally, it had been mine all along. I want to tell you about one moment, because people always ask if I got to say anything to him. At the sentencing, the judge allowed me to make a statement. I'd written something long the night before, pages of it, all the rage of 15 years. But when I stood up, I left the pages on the table. I looked at him, smaller now, in that jumpsuit, none of the smile left, and I said only this. My mother braided my hair every morning for the first 9 years of my life. You took the rest of her years one at a time when you thought no one was counting. I held up the tin box. She was counting. Every day she was counting. And she taught me how to count too. Then I sat down. That was all. The quiet thing inside me didn't need anything more. I didn't become a millionaire overnight. I want to say that plainly because I've heard people say these stories always end with some impossible fairy tale. And that's not what happened to me. The restitution came in slow payments over years. I kept my accounting job for a while, then eventually opened my own small practice. And here's the part that means the most to me. I specialize now in helping elderly clients protect their finances from exactly the kind of person my stepfather was. I teach free workshops at the senior center 2 towns over. I show people where the money goes when they're not looking. I show daughters and sons how to spot the slow drain before it's a flood. I named the practice after my mother. The house is still mine. I had the joint accounts dissolved, his son's things boxed up and put on the curb, and the locks changed the same week he was arrested. The first thing I did once it was truly mine and truly empty of him was plant a maple tree in the front yard, right where my father's used to be, before my stepfather cut it down. It's small still. It'll be years before it gives any real shade, but I sit on the porch in the evenings sometimes, with my mother's tin box on the step beside me, and I watch it grow. And I think about how the bravest thing she ever did was the quietest. She didn't fight him with noise. She fought him with a folder and a pen, and the faith that her daughter would know what to do with the numbers. And I did, Mama. I did. If you've made it this far, and if any part of this sounded like a house you grew up in or a marriage you're watching from the outside, I want to tell you the one thing it took me 28 years to learn. The person hurting your family is counting on your silence and your shame. They are counting on you being too tired, too scared, too embarrassed to write it down. So write it down. Keep the records. Make the copies. You don't have to scream. You just have to be the one who is counting when they thought no one was. I keep her box on the mantel now, where the afternoon light hits it. Some mornings, out of habit I can't explain, I still reach up to where the winter blankets used to be. And then I remember she left everything right out in the open for me. The moment I was finally ready to look, the thing I keep coming back to, all these years later, is how quiet the strongest moment of my mother's life actually was. She didn't throw a single dish. She never raised her voice at the man draining her dry. She sat in that house dying, and she did the one thing he never imagined a tired, frightened woman would do. She wrote it all down, every forged check, every stolen dollar. And then she trusted me to finish it. I think about cause and effect a lot now, because my whole story is built on it. My stepdad believed he could take and take because no one had ever made him pay for anything. He mistook my mother's silence for surrender, and he mistook mine for weakness. But silence isn't the same as absence. We were both there. We were both counting. The reason he ended up in a cell isn't luck or some cosmic justice. It's that two women refused to let cruelty go undocumented, and paper outlasts a smile every single time. If there's anything I'd want you to carry out of my kitchen and into your own life, it's this. First, do the right thing even when no one's watching and no one's clapping. I paid that rent with a smile, not because I was weak, but because I knew that staying honest and patient would matter more in the end than any satisfying outburst. Doing what's decent when you're furious is the hardest discipline there is, and it's the one that wins. Second, learn how things actually work. I didn't beat my stepdad with rage, I beat him with knowledge. Understanding money, understanding the law, understanding that the difference between a sad story and a conviction is a clear paper trail. That's what saved me. Curiosity and learning aren't just school things, they're armor. Whatever your version of the numbers is, learn it well enough that no one can lie to you about your own life. And third, endure. 11 months caring for my dying mother. 6 weeks living beside the man who robbed her, passing him the salt, smiling. A year of depositions and waiting rooms. There were nights I wanted to quit and just walk away from that house and let him have it. But the people who win aren't the ones who feel no fear. They're the ones who keep getting up and showing up anyway. One ordinary day at a time until the quiet work is done. My mother braided my hair for 9 years and counted in secret for 15 more. She gave me a tin box and 4 words, make it count. I planted a maple tree where my fathers used to stand, and some evenings I sit out there and watch it grow, slow and stubborn, and I think, that's all any of us can do. Stay good. Stay sharp. Stay standing. The roots take their time, but they hold.